Sophie Hatters is the main protagonist of both the novel and film adaptation of Howl's Moving Castle.
Sophie!
Set in a world full of wizards, fire demons, and enchanted spells, we have Sophie, who spends her days living a humble and somewhat mediocre life, working day in and day out making hats. The scenes with Sophie Hatters' room, for me, is one that lingers long after the film credits have rolled. The story of Sophie's character growth and development is one of my favourites, and I wanted to recreate her room as a miniature with the added challenge of working at a 1 in 100 scale. A 1 in 100 scale would mean that our equivalent of 1mm would equate to 10 centimeters on a metric ruler. Since Sophie's room, along with everything else in the film, is entirely fictional, this little guy that I picked up from the local craft shop was good enough to use as a sizing reference. One of the things that always stood out to me in Howl's Moving Castle was the contrast between Sophie's simple room and the magical world outside. The main features of her room include the wooden floors, the door, a wooden window and wooden shelves, as well as a wooden workbench and drawer units. It was a lot of wood. Starting with coffee stirrers and balsa wood, I cut out all my pieces to fit my little room. I wanted to make the most of the wooden texture in my materials. So I boiled up some coffee to prepare the stain. Just a simple mixture of hot water and instant coffee set aside to cool. I needed a few layers to achieve the staining intensity. I ended up just soaking my wood in puddles of coffee. I left the coffee to dry overnight. Varnishing took another few hours to dry. Once all the pieces were stained and varnished, Sophie's room could be assembled. I firstly needed to prepare a wallpaper, so I cut some plain 190 GSM watercolor paper to wrap around the room. The window looked like those European cottage windows, except with a bit of Japanese influence in the design. I tried to recreate the frames. To add some dimension to the window, I lined the edges with some wooden panes. The window was then glued onto a sheet of plastic film, very similar to cellophane, and it was packaging that I scrapped from a gift card. In the film, notice how there's a bit of relief carving on the door? I thought it was important to replicate this. So I ended up gluing thinner strips of wood onto a sheet of balsa wood. I sanded everything to thin down the raised edges. I also used a gold crimp bead as the doorknob and clipped a tiny piece of paperclip for the door handle. I wanted to add a bit more detail on the door, so I cut a tiny strip of gold washi tape for the door mortise and strike plate. Similar to the door, I glued strips of wood to create the wooden panels that lined the walls. A single sheet of balsa wood measured about 1mm in thickness. This was too thick to build individual drawers. So I decided to split a stained strip of wood in half using my craft knife and then glued each piece individually. This added a bit of dimension to the drawers and I was quite pleased with the result. I added another layer of varnish and it was time to start crafting the details. We needed some fabric rolls, which was created by rolling up some craft paper and washi tapes. We could imagine Sophie reaching up to the shelf above to snip a strip of ribbon as she decorates her hats. So I decided to mount a waterfall of ribbons with the spools sitting upright and the ribbons draping against the edge of the shelf. The individual ribbon spools were made using a 2mm hole punch. I punched out some circular discs on a 300 GSM cardstock paper, glued 2 discs together to form a ribbon spool, and rolled up thin strips of washi tapes onto each paper disc. Sophie also had this wooden stool in her workshop. I actually made a few iterations for this chair. Using a standard office hole punch, I punched out the seat, then cut little strips of the same cardstock paper for the backrest and legs. Since this is a hat shop, we needed some miniature hats. Using a standard hole punch, I punched out larger paper discs that would make both the hat brim and top. We also needed a hat band, which was made by wrapping a strip of paper around bamboo skewer sticks. I glued everything together and trimmed the top to make a top hat. These hats also needed some hat stands, so I created some wooden head mannequins by filing down a bamboo skewer stick. The hat fit quite nicely on the mannequin. Using similar filing techniques, I also made wooden hat blocks, which are tiny blocks of wood for molding hats that you see in the background of Sophie's room, as well as a miniature jar for holding feather decorations. Beside Sophie's workbench is a corkboard adorned with lots of flower decorations for her hats. I imagined this to look like a beautiful spread of floral pins and thought that rhinestones would be perfect for replicating this. The smallest sized stones that I could find were 2mm, which were actually large for this project. I decided to just go with this, with some larger stones to just add a bit more sparkle to the room. I also used a green rhinestone for the pincushion. Because it was sparkly, I tried to dampen down the reflectiveness by adding a coat of craft glue that dries semi-clear. The process of hat making would also require a fair bit of tools. I tried to recreate the tool rack in the film by firstly filing some grooves into a stained strip of wood. I then bent a 40 gauge floristry wire with a pinched tip to look like tiny pliers. and then assembled the tool rack by gluing all the tools into the grooves. I also bent some floristry wire to make tiny handles. I found that by flattening the end tip of the wire helped with manipulating the tips into the smallest ring possible, which would make the handles. I then twisted the handles together to form something that looked like scissors. This was the smallest I could manage by hand. I trimmed the scissor blades down to measure closer to 4mm, which is still a bit large for a 1 in 100 scale. Using the same wire bending technique, I created the coat rack. The central pole of the coat rack was made by sanding down a bamboo skewer stick. I then glued each wire onto the rack and painted everything. Since I've made an iron before, I thought it would be nice to make one for this room, except being more in line with the style of a vintage iron. Apparently these are called sad irons, which historically means heavy and solid. I also cut the tip of a plastic disposable micropipette to create the candle. While I focused more on the interior of Sophie's room, I felt like the room exterior also needed a bit of colour. There are only brief cuts of Sophie's room in the film to work with as references, so building a miniature version leaves a lot open to interpretation. Even at the start of the film, I noticed there are actually 2 rooms, the first being Sophie's workshop and the second being her bedroom that was located upstairs. Later in the film, Howl recreates her room, and in this recreation, both rooms seem to have fused into one, with all the intricate details of the Hatters' workshop stripped away. Perhaps a metaphor for the evolution of Sophie's character after everything she went through in the film. She no longer needed to return to her life as a hat maker. In spite of this, Sophie is still shown sewing clothes and working on her workbench. Her sense of practicality has remained a constant throughout the film. Just like how the new version of her room is faithfully reminiscent of the original workshop. In that sense, the humble hat shop where Sophie spent most of her days at the start of the film is more than just a physical space that gradually gets shed away, but a beautiful starting point for where her story unravels.